And I think some images can help us to understand it. One big advantage, of course, is the military technology that the Spaniards have, right? This is not a picture of a conquistador. This is simply a 16th century soldier. But this shows his weapons and armor would be similar, right? You see he's got the arquebus. He has a gun. And he can use that gun to shoot someone. And it makes a lot of noise and an impressive flash. And there is... they discovered the remains of one Incan who had been shot. And he'd been shot in the back of the head. He was probably retreating. And the bullet came out the front of his head, or front of his face. And one thing about bullet wounds, the hole they make coming out of a person is bigger than the hole they make going into the person. And I don't want to be gross here, but literally this gun blew this poor man's face off, right? The bullet entered the back of his head and came out and went like this. And from the perspective of the Aztecs and Incas, this is horrifying. I mean, to us, just the image is horrifying, but to them, they don't understand guns. This almost seems like magic, right? You point this thing at someone, you pull a trigger, there's smoke, there's light, and a big flash, and this guy's face is gone, and he's dead. That's pretty horrifying. Now, while that's scary, the Spanish had other advantages, right? The Spanish had other advantages. Again, with military technology, they had swords, steel swords, and they had steel armor. You'll notice the Aztecs, they have clubs, which usually had like obsidian or other rock tips that they're able to use, but it doesn't do much damage against steel armor. Bows and arrows can be effective weapons, but again, they don't do much against steel. They're just going to bounce off. And if you read the descriptions written by the Spanish of what war was like, they're like, yeah, I got hit by a bunch of stones, I get hit by some arrows, I get hit by some clubs, but I was okay. And meanwhile, I'm stabbing Aztecs left and right with my sword. And the Aztecs have basically like heavy cloth armor. The sword cuts through that, no problem. In addition, the Europeans had the advantage of having domesticated animals. They had mastiffs, giant war dogs, which were horrifying for the Aztecs, right? To be able to try and fight against, right? And dogs, especially attack dogs, don't know fear. They'll just charge at you and bite you and won't stop till you or they are dead. And also the Europeans, the Spanish had horses, right? The Spanish had horses. Horses had died off. They'd been hunted to extinction in the Americas until they were reintroduced by Europeans. And again, the Aztecs had not seen something like horses. They initially thought that the horse and the person were one creature, and then the person got off and they were like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And even once they understood that they were two creatures, you line up a bunch of horses with people on them and they charge at you, you can't stop them. It is very difficult to stop a cavalry charge, especially when you've got guys armed with steel armor and weapons. So there's a huge technological advantage that the Europeans have. Unfortunately for the poor Aztecs, they're stuck, right? They didn't really ever develop metal working. They're using essentially Stone Age weapons technology, whereas Europeans have some of the most advanced weapons technology in the world. Now, a question that may be raising in your head is, okay, I get that these are the Spanish. That's fairly obvious. I get that these are the Aztecs. Well, who are these guys? Well, I kind of played a little trick when I talked about the numbers of Aztecs and the numbers of Spaniards and so forth. Because what ended up happening was a large number, tens of thousands, in fact, of Native Americans joined the Spanish against the Aztecs. Tens of thousands, right, of Native Americans joined the Spanish against the Aztecs. Why? Remember, the Aztecs demanded tribute from the people around them. And the Aztecs ruled primarily through fear. They hadn't really integrated people into their civilization, right? After being part of the Roman Empire for hundreds of years, for example, people in Spain thought themselves as Romans. People in Greece and in the Byzantine Empire still thought themselves as Romans, right? In Rome, they had been able to integrate the people they conquered. The Aztecs had not been able to do that yet. And the problem is, remember that the Aztecs used human sacrifice in part to scare people to obey them. And so the problem is, when you rule through fear, as long as people are most afraid of you, everything's okay. But what happens when someone scarier than you comes? Well, the Spanish are certainly scarier than the Aztecs. They had this new technology, these new weapons. They're going to be able now to go out and fight, right? And defeat the Aztecs, hopefully. So let's join them. So many native peoples are not happy with Aztec rule, and they hope they'll get a better deal from the Spanish. In the end, they probably don't. I mean, the Spanish don't sacrifice them, but they do kill a lot of them. So, it's tricky. But for our purposes here, the key thing is there's a lot of frustration with the Aztec Empire. It's not well integrated. People want their independence, so they're going to join with the Spanish against the Aztecs. What's key about this, too, we have to note, is the importance of a woman named Donna Morena. You may ask yourself, how does this work? Like, how do you form alliances when you don't speak the same language, right? The Spanish show up in the modern-day Mexico. How do they talk to anyone? And there's different ways that they do this. For example, there was a Spanish person, a priest actually, who had been captured and basically made a slave, and he had learned to speak some before the Spanish managed to recapture him and free him. But a really important person is this woman known to the Spanish as Donna Morena. So Donna Morena was a really good linguist. Like, she was really, really good at learning languages. So she spoke multiple languages. She was not herself an Aztec, but she spoke her own language as well as that of neighboring groups. And in this way, she was able to work with Cortez to be able to form alliances. And it's kind of tricky. Again, this is a really complex period. We don't have a whole bunch of time to talk about it. But basically, her dad gave her and 19 other women to the Spanish kind of as slaves. Slavery, is a difficult term to define because it's not like they were sold, and I don't think Cortez could have sold them, but also they're kind of being treated like property, right? They're being given away. So these women are given to Cortez. Donna Morena ends up becoming and that's the word the Spanish use for them. These women are converted to Christianity, right? They're not quite sure what it would seem, they're not really in a position to disagree, so they accept Christianity. They live in a hierarchical society, a patriarchal one, and Cortez and the others are just like, you're going to become Christians now. And they're like, okay. But that's part of building an alliance, right? Donna Morena's father, the guy who gives away these women, including his daughter, to the Spanish, wants to form an alliance with them to get rid of Aztec rule. And you can see Donna Morena here in this image, and this is a contemporary image. I love this, how skilled they are at showing what she's doing. You can see she's pointing, and Cortez is doing the same thing. She is really gifted and learns Spanish very quickly, and then can act as an interpreter. And what she does then here, you can see she's telling Cortez what to do. She understands etiquette. She understands the language. And so what happens is when you've got these local elites who want to unite with Cortez to fight against the Aztecs, she's able to organize the talks and help make arrangements so they can work together, right? And you can see they've offered gifts. She's going to tell them how to accept those gifts and how to build this alliance. So she's a very, very important person for making this possible, where they're going to have all these Native Americans who will help them defeat the Aztecs. And I want to stress, without their help, they couldn't have done this. This would have failed. This would not have been successful. Now, again, like Magellan, Donna Morena has a very complex legacy. And part of this, in a lot of this class, I tried to hold up people as like heroes and like, this person's just awesome, right? Because of what they represent. And in this section, I've tried to show how things are complex. So, of course, among many people, Donna Morena represented the birth of a new people, of the Mexican people in a sense, because many Mexicans are mestizos. They're mix of, they're biracial or even more than biracial, several races, but they're often the descendants of European people and native peoples. And in Spanish, such people are called mestizos. And my children are mestizos because that same term was used in the Philippines to describe people of European descent and people of Filipino descent, mestizos. And so Donna Morena, she had children by Cortez. She was his mistress. And so those are seen as the first mestizos. And it's kind of the birth of a New Mexico, in a sense. So some people look to her as kind of a hero, right? She's like the mother of a new people, right? That are a joining of the so-called New World and Old World. Other people see her as a traitor, right? Because of her, the Aztecs were conquered. The Aztecs were the most powerful group, and they're the ones that maybe could have kept an independent Native America empire against the Spanish, right? They could have, if the Native Americans would have worked together, they could have kept the Spanish out, and that would have prevented a lot of the atrocities that the Spanish would later on commit. So you also have that perspective. Some feminist feminists looking back at this tend to emphasize Donna Morena as a victim, right? She's just given away and basically forced to become Cortez's mistress, and then ends up dying quite young. So, like I say, it's very complex. You can look at this woman as a hero. You can look at her as a villain. You can understand her as someone who we should feel kind of bad for because she was in a difficult situation. And as a historian, I would just point out we have to be careful about taking our categories we have today and putting them on people there. And we also have to remember hindsight. Donna Morena and the people who supported her, these Native Americans working with Cortez, they didn't know what the future would be. They just knew that they didn't like the deal they had with the Aztecs, that they thought the Aztecs were being too strict with them. In any case, it's complex, right? And people can disagree about these figures. The last major issue that's going to have a significant impact is disease. The Spanish don't intend it, but they bring with them a huge amount of disease, especially smallpox and measles. And this is smallpox here among the Aztec people, is going to be particularly lethal. So Europeans lost, I think, about 250,000 people a year to smallpox. It was pretty bad. That's the size of a very major city, right? Especially in this time period. But Europeans had dealt with smallpox for hundreds of years. It wasn't going to wipe out their civilization. But the Aztecs had never been exposed to it. And there's a whole bunch of diseases they'd never been exposed to. They hadn't been exposed to the plague, hadn't been exposed to measles, to chickenpox, to a whole bunch of diseases, typhus, yellow fever, all those things. They didn't exist in the New World. Asians, Europeans, and Africans had been trading diseases back and forth for hundreds of years, and so it had time to build up an immunity. But the poor Aztecs and other Native Americans, they get hit by these diseases all at once. Right? They get hit by these diseases all at once. It's really terrible for them. They don't have any immunity towards them. So remember how bad the plague was for the Europeans. Well, the poor Aztecs and the Incas and other Native Americans get hit by several at the same time. And so when the conquistadors, when Cortez conquers Tenochtitlan, huge numbers of Aztec people were actually sick and unable to fight because they had smallpox. And in the case of the Incas, the Incan emperor died of smallpox. And you may say, well, that's unfortunate, but at least he has a crown prince, right? He has a succession. No, his son also died of smallpox. So then that led the Incans to have a civil war between the king's two brothers over who would be the next emperor. But you can see how smallpox would be devastating. Not only did it kill large numbers of farmers who would support the troops with the food they produced, it would kill a large number of soldiers who would need to fight. And if you were really unlucky, it would kill emperors. So this was absolutely devastating. And just to give you a number, it's estimated, I think it's in the first few decades of contact between Europeans and Native Americans, something like 90% of Native Americans will die from disease. So it's really terrible. And I think that's also key to why Pizarro and Cortez are able to conquer the Aztecs and the Incas. And so what that means, unfortunately, I'd like to talk about the joining of the New Worlds as this, wonderful time where there's all this openness and mixing of ideas and people are learning from each other. But unfortunately, it's a lot of devastation. It's a lot of death. So it's history. right? And it's a history we have to understand, we have to face. And the thing is, the worlds are now joined, right? We've got these two worlds together, and they're joined, they're connected. And what I'm going to talk about next is called the Columbian Exchange, named Columbian after Christopher Columbus. So the idea is that Christopher Columbus, by being able to go to the Americas, has now built up a connection between the so-called New World and the so-called Old World. So unfortunately, one thing that spreads is disease, right? Smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough. All these things are going to be going from Europe to the Americas. And like I said, upwards of 90% of the native population will be wiped out. So we're starting on kind of a downer, but we have to just, I feel it's appropriate to mention that first. From the Americas, you have all these wonderful crops: tomatoes, beans, potatoes, coffee, corn, and other crops, right? Sweet potatoes, turkeys, pumpkins, all these wonderful things. Cacao, right? You could get chocolate. And, you know, it's kind of funny. We think of, for example, Italian food. It wasn't the same, right? And particularly important, I don't see it. Oh yeah, peppers. When you think of like Southern Chinese food, or you think of Korean food, you think of some food that's really spicy because they use chilies. Like I specialize in Korea. Koreans put chili pepper, usually in a form of paste, on everything. It didn't exist before the Columbian Exchange in Asia, right? It existed in the Americas, but wasn't part of Korean cooking. To the Americas, we'll have wheat, sugarcane, cattle, pigs, and horses. So people are going to get new food crops. They're going to get access to new food crops. And especially this is really good for Europe because this, and to a certain extent Africa and Asia, but we're focusing on Europe here. This will allow population growth. For example, potatoes. Potatoes can grow in really bad soil, and they have a lot of calories. So you can plant them in places where you previously couldn't grow crops, and they give a lot of calories so they can support a lot of people. And if you, some of your ancestors are Irish, like mine are mostly German, but there's some Irish there too. A lot of them came when the potato crop that they had come to depend on, when it was hit by a terrible disease called the potato blight in the 19th century, it drove them out of Ireland. And that's how a lot of Irish people came to the United States. So you're going to have new foods moving around, giving people access to more variety, which is always great, but also new crops that can grow in bad soil that previously couldn't be used for. This leads to more food production. And whenever you have food production, you have population growth. This will lead, the population growth means in a sense that there will be excess population in Europe and they will immigrate. So you may recall when I talked about the plague, one thing that made Europeans vulnerable to the plague was they weren't getting enough food to eat because they had run out of land. Well, now it doesn't matter. There's pressure on land. You don't have access to land in Europe. Get on a ship, go to the New World, and there's land. After all, something like 90% of the native peoples died, so you can get access to that land. And if there's native peoples there, unfortunately, we have the military technology. They'll just, sad to say, push them out. And I do want to note that oftentimes this is involuntary because, of course, you have Africans being forced to come as slaves to the New World as well. I talk more about that in History 122, but I do need to mention this. So in a sense, this is an uneven exchange. Europe and to a lesser extent Africa and Asia benefit from this. The native people of the Americas do not benefit that much from it. And it's a sad story, I think, because we had these civilizations that basically get wiped out. And we have large numbers of people who get wiped out. So and I want to stress, it's not like the Europeans necessarily intended this, right? They didn't intend. I mean, there's a couple cases where Europeans did attempt, that's later, I think in the 17th century, to spread disease. But the Spanish were not trying to spread disease, right? But this is unfortunately what happens when you have these groups of people meeting together. And this is, by the way, why there's a tendency. There are still some people who are at a Stone Age level of technology and who are isolated. For example, there's a group of people in islands off the coast of India, and no one's allowed to approach them, because if they were to come in contact with people, with other people, they would die very quickly because we would give them diseases, right? They're still isolated groups of people, and we don't want to have contact with them today because if we did, it would kill them. So this is a complex legacy. And one thing there's a lot I hope you got out of this class. But one thing I hope you get from this is, again, history is complex. It's hard to say something's just positive or negative. Things can have positive and negative aspects, and oftentimes the negative outdoes the positive, right? The negative is there's worse things happen than better things happen, right? And that's unfortunate. But as a historian, it's my job to say as much as possible what happened. And it's my hope that you learn something in this class that will help you to determine how to make a better world in the future. But here's the thing, right? Ending the class, the different cultures humans developed after spreading out are now in contact again. That's the world we live in, right? The different cultures humans developed after spreading out are now in contact again. That is the world we live in, a globalized world. And our world is very diverse. There's lots of different kinds of people. There are very major differences in civilizations. I hope you've gotten that out of this class, that people often have very deep differences. And hopefully we can recognize those differences. We can respect each other, and we can work together as much as possible to make this a better world where we're all win-win, right? And just, I don't want to get on a soapbox too much. But I just want to note that in doing this, I think a wonderful kind of maxim that we can live by, presented here by Norman Rockwell, though of course he didn't come up with this. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I think that's the so-called golden rule. I think it's a good rule. I think if we did our best to follow it, we would live in a better world. I think now you're equipped, as much as this class could help you get equipped to help make this a better world. So good luck, and enjoy life, live a good life, do what you can to make this place better.